Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Susan Galassi, Senior Curator, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you here with us tonight and others who are viewing the lecture via Foix video. So welcome to all. This is the second evening, the second salon evening, held in conjunction with the exhibition David d'Angers, The Making of a Modern Monument, which was organized by the former Andrew Mellon Fellow Emerson Boyer. This exhibition, which has been receiving rave reviews, including just one today in the Wall Street Journal, will remain on view in the downstairs exhibition galleries through December 8th. We are honored to have as our speaker tonight Professor Barry Bergdoll, one of the foremost figures in the world in architectural studies. Trained as an art historian, his focus has been on modern architecture in France and Germany from 1750 to 1900. And in his exhibitions, he has focused on 20th and 21st century topics as well. His work could be described more broadly as cultural history, which finds outlets in academic and museum work, film production, and in his prolific writing and lecturing. He is also well known as a most generous mentor to legions of students, including Emerson Boyer. Since 1985, Dr. Bergdoll has been on the faculty of the Art History Department of Columbia University, the department from which he earned his BA and PhD degrees. This year, he was appointed the Meyer Shapiro Professor of Modern Architectural History at Columbia. This year as well, he stepped down from his position as the Philip Johnson Chief Curator of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art, which he has held for the past 7 years, though he remains a curator in the department. With Jean-Louis Cohen this past summer, he co-curated the exhibition Le Corbusier, an Atlas of Modern Landscape, at the Museum of Modern Art. It followed on the heels of another remarkable show that closed earlier this year, Henri Labrouste, Structure Brought to Light, held in Paris at the Museum of Architecture and Patrimony and at MoMA. Though hard to believe, this year Dr. Bergdoll also delivered the Andrew W. Mellon Lectures in the Fine Arts at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. Dr. Bergdoll is the author or co-author of 10 books and exhibition catalogs and the editor of 5 volumes of essays, and his articles appear regularly in journals throughout the world. His books and exhibitions have won many prizes. Bauhaus Workshops for Modernity, co-authored with Leah Dickinson, won the award for the Outstanding Exhibition and Catalog of the Year from the Association of Art Museum Curators. And his traveling show, Mies in Berlin, was given the Philip Johnson Award of the Society of Architectural Historians, to name only a few. This year, Dr. Bergdoll's vast contributions to the field were recognized with the Soane Foundation honor from Sir John Soane's Museum in London, and the Award for Architecture from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He is currently striking out in a new direction in an exhibition on Latin American architecture. His lecture tonight takes us to the heart of his expertise in a period he loves, that of 19th century France, in which the subject of our exhibition was a main player. The exhibition will remain open after the talk, and everyone is invited to reception in the garden court following his lecture. Please welcome Barry Bergdoll.
Thank you for that generous and detailed introduction. Indeed, this is to take me back to ancient history. I don't so much propose to speak in great detail about David d'Angers in particular, nor would I dare in front of Emerson and so many others in the room evaluate his work as a sculptor, but rather I want to put him into both the architectural and therefore inevitably the political context of the period in which he worked on either side of the Revolution of 1830. And I want in particular to look at the ways in which his work intersected in the sites and on the projects of a generation of younger architects and perhaps, but we could debate this, he is one of the sculptors of the early 19th century, the most integrated with architectural thought, practice, and also a friendship circle that, appropriately enough, encountered one another often in salons of the left bank. So together with these younger architects, for the most part a generation earlier than David d'Angers, who styled themselves romantics and who admired his political and aesthetic positions, and in a few cases worked directly with him on key monuments, David d'Angers became something of a mentor and an inspiration. The central theme here will be the presence of history in the present. And for me, of course, there is an autobiographical element, as this takes me back to work that I did over 20 years ago around the set of key figures of Romantic architecture who we'll encounter this evening. Léon Vaudoyer, Félix Dubon, Henri Labrouste, and others of the generation who built on the debates over Romantic painting and sculpture at the 1824 Salon, the one in which David d'Angers' Bonchamp monument was shown. You see it up here on the right. To engage a battle over the possibility of extending that Romantic thought in literature and playwriting, in painting and in sculpture to architecture. In the years between 1828, when the drawing you see below was exhibited and incited a heated debate over the architect Henri Labrouste's interpretation of the meaning of Greek antique architecture for the present, and the early 1830s, where I'm going to concentrate, when the Romantic generation of architects began to open teaching ateliers and to take on, in confrontation, the established idealist point of view of architectural neoclassicism in a series of provocative projects for public buildings that directly engage the issue of the presence of history in the spectacle of the modernizing city. Now, like David d'Angers, their works were to be taken up also in the frequent political upheavals of post-revolutionary France, sharing a set of fields of contestation during the years of the Bourbon Restoration, and then as young artists of the July Revolution and the constitutional monarchy, the July Monarchy that ensued, coming ultimately to professional maturity just at the moment when a second revolution, that of February 1848, would sweep in a short-lived republic. David d'Angers died in 1856 as this generation ascended to a series of monumental commissions under Napoleon III, so it's an extraordinarily movemented period. I want to follow David d'Angers as a looming presence, in particular in two sites. We're going to really not traverse a lot of ground, but we're going to traverse it back and forth, and we're going to see that the people who give them meaning are also taking the same itinerary. So here, probably a somewhat stretched version of the map that's given to you at Charles de Gaulle so you can find your way to the Galerie Lafayette. But that's not where we're going. We are going to Pere Lachaise at the Great Cemetery, one of this ring of cemeteries. We'll turn to those in a moment. And to the so-called Montagne Sainte-Geneviève. It's the highest hill in Paris, intramuros, before 1870, hence the slight exaggeration of mountain. Where we'll be visiting. I'm not finding it for you. Where is it? Right here. The Church of Sainte-Geneviève, alternatively, the Pantheon. And here I want to argue were two fields, two urban zones, which became, in fact, interconnected through the politics of monumental representation, in which the work of sculpture and architecture not only came together, but in which those sculptors and architects made common cause with opposition politics. Here's in a sense, a telescopic view from the hill of Pere Lachaise. It's actually more accurately probably from the Tour Saint-Jacques, but anyway, from elevated position towards the Pantheon. We'll be crossing over there in a moment, but let us start with Pere Lachaise. Pere Lachaise created, as part of the cemetery reform movement that got underway under the Ancien Regime, the most impressive of the great burial grounds created at the gates of the city under Napoleon to end burial in crowded Paris churchyards intramuros. It became a highly politicized terrain almost overnight after its opening around 1811. But in particular under the figure who's going to be tremendously important for us, Charles X, who took over the restored throne from his Bourbon brother Louis XVIII upon his death in 1824, the cemetery would be converted from a pastoral retreat for individual grieving and commemoration into a public landscape adopted by the liberal opposition as a place of political defiance, which would ultimately convert the 18th century cult of grands hommes, this 18th century Enlightenment cult of the great man, into a politicized set of counter-proposals as the writing of history and political alignments came into new synergies. This is a particularly interesting period. I think the history has fully to be written to explain the relationships between debates over style and the possibility of their return or revival, and the political revival of a form of government, of administration, of a relationship of beings one to another, with the return of the Bourbons and the so-called Bourbon Restoration. Let's quote the Bourbons, only one quote from them here. "The honors of the public square belong to sovereigns alone," Charles X had announced with the announcement, when the news came to him, of a public subscription to erect a fountain to the memory of Molière in the center of Paris. So we have here to stand in for that great tradition before the Ancien Regime of decorating the capital almost exclusively with portraits of reigning kings and previous monarchs in the dynastic line. And of course, I really should show you these in a public square, because the history of royal representation and the history of public space in the 18th century are so thoroughly interconnected. Here, ultimately, many years later, the fountain and monument to Molière that would be raised by public subscription of his admirers standing at that key point in the Rue Richelieu. This was the stark remark, "The honors of the public square belong to sovereigns alone," and which explains, I think, in large measure, the intensification of the political stakes of public commemorations during the reign of the last Bourbons. In the 6 years between the great state funeral of Louis XVIII at Saint-Denis in October 1824 and the Trois Glorieuses, the Revolution of July 1830, Paris would become the focal point of innumerable public ceremonies and of projects of monuments to figures whose lives themselves became at once commemorative of the past and marked a position on the continuum between present and future. Despite, or more likely because of Charles X's position eroding the revolutionary gains of the 1790s on public space, this period would see a proliferation not only of royal festivals and ceremonies, but also the rapid rise of a ceremonial culture of the liberal opposition. In particular, great orators, and now we can go back and find the hero that all fans of David d'Angers were waiting to appear. There he is, the General Maximilien Foix. We will be with him for almost as long as his short life. Just a minute. So in particular, great orators like Foix, this Napoleonic general turned orator in the chamber, and defenders of the liberties guaranteed by the charter under which the Bourbons ruled, concerning in particular liberty of the press and liberty of expression, these orators would be honored in a series of events meant to assert the rights of the political opposition and its sympathizers to express themselves in the streets of the capital and to erect funerary monuments to their own heroes. The funeral processions of popular figures of the liberal opposition, as well even of artists who supported them, gave rise to spectacles that were meant to rally crowds and to show the importance of popular support and the quantity of popular support for the opposition. The funerary processions, for instance, of Foix, the General Foix in 1825, of Talma in 1826, of Manuel in 1827, transformed the capital for a single day with new symbolic roots, linking monuments and spaces and generally concluding at Pere Lachaise. The funeral orations at the graveside, and here we see an engraving somewhere between oration and apotheosis at the graveside of Foix, at the graveside often continued for hours and gathered thousands, sometimes tens of thousands. Public subscriptions for permanent monuments would demonstrate the will and even the right of the people to render homage during public ceremonies. Pere Lachaise would, in these years, kind of prototype of almost of all picturesque ceremonies, picturesque cemeteries on the continent, Pere Lachaise would experience a rapid evolution of perception from a place of mourning, and I think these engravings from the very beginning of the 19th century, Pere Lachaise in its very earliest years, where it seems still to be a place that's to create a landscape of mourning, of individual loss, of a relationship between death, decay, and contemplation, to increasingly ones that are not lost in the cemetery, but feature the cemetery in the cityscape, and quite frequently with particularly as in the one by Turner on the right, with these dramatic weather events happening to call attention, almost to shine a spotlight on a number of features in the skyline that would quickly relate to the monumental foreground landscape of the cemetery itself. So the cemetery, we might say, was almost being transformed into a place of grand celebration of great figures of action, caught often at the moment of greatest effectiveness, even as the debate began to emerge in new historical writing on the relationship of individual action to larger historical evolution. Under Charles X, the tombs of great opposition figures, Foix, Manuel, and later Casimir Perier, would reach unprecedented size and architectural innovation, celebrated often in prints that were meant at once to raise funds and also to emphasize the relationship of the tombs, erected for the most part on the highest points of the hilly terrain of Pere Lachaise, with the monuments of the capital. Not the least with the dome, and you'll see this in almost every image, not the least with the dome of the 18th century church of St. Geneviève, turned into the Pantheon, the temple of great men under the Revolution, which Louis XVIII had returned on the anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 to sacred use. Napoleon had tried a hybrid solution, so just to put more salt in the wound, giving it back to the church on the anniversary date of the Battle of Waterloo. Chased from the Pantheon, the rights of designating great men would now be appropriated by the opposition and become a site of experimentation as well for a new generation of sculptors and architects. Now today this visual link is very, very clear in this engraving, which is key for us because we want to spend the next few minutes with this outsized monument here that will bring together my hero Léon Vaudoyer, the architect, with the sculptor David d'Angers. You see that landscape, some industrial interference, of course, but also the relationship to the dome of the Pantheon. Today that's impossible because of the tree growth to ascertain. But it does explain, I think, these engravings, why the 27th division of the cemetery basically became, within a few short years, the Acropolis of the liberal opposition. For it was at the Pantheon in the 1790s that let's go back to the 1790s at the Pantheon. This is how it was intended, as a representation of Sainte Geneviève floating above the city of Paris. So the dome was literally the embodiment of her protective presence at the crown of the hill, this gift of Louis XV in honor of the patron saint of Paris. The church taken away from her and given by the Revolution to the celebration of a new cult of civic saints, the saints of great men. Would not be really until the middle of the 19th century that the debate over whether there were great women would take place. That was only really to happen under the Third Republic. But here we see, I love to juxtapose the print of the funeral of Voltaire, which takes place in an imaginary Roman city that had resprout the Pantheon, and Rousseau, who came from Ermenonville with a much-needed tree, bringing nature back into just a few years later, 1794. These were absolutely extraordinary ceremonies of the Revolution, this culte, le culte des grands hommes, which developed a whole new civic liturgy of pantheonization, along with the words that went with it, to pantheonize, and a little bit too soon, to depantheonize. This ceremony of pantheonization had been conducted many times during the Napoleonic Empire, perhaps too many, but it was abolished abruptly with the return of the Bourbons to power. After 1816, Soufflot's great monument was, I'll leave that up for a minute, was cleared of the memorials to Voltaire and Rousseau along with their bodies, and also stripped of the great inscription. I'll give it to you first in French because it's going to recur over and over again. Aux grands hommes la patrie reconnaissante, the appreciative country to great men. Aux grands hommes la patrie reconnaissante was scraped from the pediment. Under the direction of the architect Louis-Pierre Baltard, this is the father of the famous Baltard, later of Les Halles, the great pediment was reworked to celebrate an allegory of the glory of Paris's patron saint once again. Now the hill of Pere Lachaise became the destination of this displaced civic liturgy. The great historian Louis Blanc first pointed out the parallelism between the great dynastic ceremonies, the lavish state funeral of Louis XVIII on the left, October 25th, 1824, in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, and the Sacre, or the coronation of Charles X on the right at Reims Cathedral on May 29, 1825, and the creation, in parallel, Blanc noticed, of a public funeral ritual for the liberal opposition, supported in great measure by the students of the École of the left bank, and in particular by the law students, struck increasingly by the monarchy's irrepressive departure from its governing charter. The funeral of General Maximilien Foix was the counterpoint to the celebration of the royal consecration, Blanc wrote. Over 100,000 people, incredible for the 19th century, followed Foix's coffin in a torrential downpour to Pere Lachaise cemetery on November 30th, 1825. Foix had died just 2 days earlier at the age of 50. A vibrant orator of the liberal opposition in the Chamber of Deputies, known especially for his defense of the Charter and notably of the freedom of the press, the funerals were, despite the refusal of the government for official participation, among the most important public events of the decade. The crowd followed from Foix's house in La Chaussée-d'Antin, and what do I do with that pointer? Here we go. If you go there today, it's still the marker where Foix's journey started. So being to get these funeral ceremonies that take in both public monuments and places that are important to the life of the individual being celebrated, as though that passage of life can become a public passage in the boulevards, picking up followers as it moves through. An absolute, just go on the internet, put funeral General Foix, and you will have about 17 pages of popular prints of various versions of mourning. Quite fascinating that this angel and this crown are the first indication that the iconography of pantheonization, as well as of sainthood, is being transposed. So the crowd follows from Foix's house to the parish church of Saint-Jean, then following the boulevards along to Pere Lachaise, where intentionally, just as in pantheonizations in the 1790s, the group arrives at dusk. This had always been the moment to enter the Pantheon, obviously with ancient and mythological sources, and now the group arrives at the threshold of the highest hill on the left bank. Estimates vary, depending on which political color of press you read, between 40 and 100,000, not that unlike police estimates for crowds today in political manifestations. In addition to the liberal opposition around the bankers Laffitte, the legislators Casimir Perier and Manuel, and the poet Béranger, Foix's death had an effect on the youth of Paris, comparable in our time perhaps to the effect of Kennedy's assassination 2 generations ago. Numerous diaries of the period record this as a formative personal event as much as a national rallying point. Alexandre Dumas recalls in his diary how he learned of the news returning home from work when, quote, "a piece of news personally devastating to me struck. I went immediately to my mother's house, and as weak as I was, I understood that this famous deceased man had something to expect from a young man to whom he had shown a career path." Dumas recounts that he sat down immediately to write a poem and then rushed out to join the funeral procession. Diaries can, I suppose, be somewhat apocryphal as well. Later, the funeral procession would be seen as an event leading up to the Revolution of July 1830. Among the crowd present was David d'Angers, who recalled that one was struck, he said, by the impressive silence that reigned. Every individual present fought by this action against the government. He claimed even this evening as a catalytic factor in his determination to use his art as an archive of collective memory. The permanent monument to General Foix has been studied in numerous recent studies. Now, before we get to it, I think we can't forget that it's also a kind of counter-monument to this brand new monument by Bosio, that Louis XVIII had commissioned an expiatory chapel from the architects Percy and Fontaine with sculpture work by Bosio and others for the apotheosis of Louis the 16th. So we are looking at a real war of symbols and of burials. Here are some of the other poems of the period, and here the monument. Now, the permanent monument to General Foix has been studied in recent numerous studies on David d'Angers, as well as my own monograph on the young architect who became his partner in arms here, Léon Vaudoyer, 15 years younger than the sculptor and still a student at the École des Beaux-Arts. Very, very rare that a student at the École des Beaux-Arts gets a commission, certainly not one of such prominence. But two elements in this vast literature, I think, should be drawn out, as they reveal the extent to which this monument became a prototype for a whole series of funeral monuments that were at once public and political. The first is the extent to which the conception, realization, and inauguration of the monument were adroitly orchestrated by the liberal opposition to preserve ever present the memory of the funeral event itself and the public support it had made manifest for their cause. In other words, the experience of the day was not to be lost. The second is the fact, rarely noted, of the extent to which the monument's meaning derives in large measure from its adoption of a language and iconography which clearly meant to revive the forms and rituals of the revolutionary Pantheon. It was during an impassioned speech during Foix's funeral that the idea was born of launching a subscription to help his widow and 5 children, as well as to erect a monument to replace what you see here, the modest temporary tombstone that had been put in place shortly after the burial. Almost overnight, 980,000 francs were raised. But as Stendhal wrote, it matters little if his children have 200 or 1,000 francs of income, perhaps a little to Stendhal. The part of the nation that is alive intends to take advantage of the passing of General Foix to raise a monument to liberty and to the anti-monarchist spirit. There's one of the, I think that's Lafayette's subscription there. In addition to an immediate cottage industry in souvenirs from the Lowe, it's a fire back in iron of General Foix, to a very expensive mantle clock replete with a very secret Masonic imagery. It also included handkerchiefs, engravings, models of the tomb, as you might expect, fans, and many other objects. I don't know. The continued fans of Foix can try on eBay, I suppose. A public competition was launched immediately for a monument. Rather than the limited number of invited competitions the regime had launched, and competitions are extremely rare in early 19th century France, and even more so during the Bourbon Restoration. One notable exception in 1823 was the Church of Notre-Dame de Lorette. This competition, it was decided immediately, would be a public competition, a sort of open national referendum. 38 projects were received, the deadline was short, and these were immediately put on display, an exhibit, in the Bazaar commercial building in the Rue Saint-Honoré, kind of forerunner to the department store. So also the use of this commercial space as a public space for having a public viewing and a sort of public referendum. The jury was made up of artists and politicians aligned with the opposition, as well as by 9 artists, 3 sculptors, 3 painters, and 3 architects who were added by election to those who had submitted to the competition. So there's a sort of preset jury, and then those who were in the competition got to elect their own jurors. Most of the entries came from students at the École des Beaux-Arts, many of whom had been among the crowds at the funeral. It was won by a young architectural student, Léon Vaudoyer, that took the prize. His dates are 1803 to 1872. He, in turn, was asked to propose a list of 6 sculptors he would like to work with, of whom David d'Angers, famous already, there they are together, David d'Angers, Léon Vaudoyer, not so young. That's the only respectable portrait I could find. That's a really late one. He should look younger than the sculptor. And David d'Angers, famous already, of course, for the work that you recognize on the right, the Grand Condé of 1817, as well as for his clear emerging republicanism, was chosen on the first round. Now, the conception of Vaudoyer and David d'Angers was an interpretation of an established funeral type, the temple edicule atop a very high base, which forms in this case a frame for the statue of the deceased, depicted at the high point of his career as an orator, as if his tomb would serve as an eternal speaker's rostrum. Here we see him in speech, of course, as we could expect with David d'Angers, there's an enormous debate over the dress of this figure. Should it be in modern dress? Should it be in ancient dress? This accompanies so many of David d'Angers' commissions, but it also goes very much to the heart of debates over whether the role of art was to represent the ideal or to represent something of historic specificity. What was art meant to transpose us beyond the everyday, or was it meant to plant the everyday in a larger experience? And this clearly went back and forth on this competition because there are drawings that represent the figure in both modern and in ancient dress. But ultimately, antique dress was preferred for the orator, making the speech not only timeless and eternal, but I suppose in a certain way endless, but set in a very interesting counterpoint, which we'll see in a moment. Now, the approach, architecturally, was not without echoes of the rustic monument imagined by Hubert Robert in 1794, when Rousseau's remains were transferred from Ermenonville to the Pantheon. But for contemporaries, it was not so much this, the memory of this monument long gone, it was the parallel with an immediate predecessor, the monument to Malesherbes, an official monument of royal commission at the Palais de Justice, that must have been the most striking comparison. This too in honor of a great orator, but one admired by the government. This monument was realized by the architect Hippolyte Lebas, Vaudoyer's uncle and teacher, and the sculptor Bosio. Here the monument ordered by the crown was now to be countered by a popular hero in public space of the opposition. This is a page from Lebas' sketchbook that shows him hesitating, trying to find a type for the monument to Malesherbes, and it provides a kind of typology of the different ways that a sculpture might relate to a piece of architecture. The most architectural, the wall-mounted edicule, and then here, and of course this is rather interesting, this rejected proposal is basically the one that the nephew and student will take up to use for the public cemetery. Here are some alternatives. Now, the iconography and the inscription of the Foix monument also recall the suppressed ritual of pantheonization. One of the variants proposed, the one here on the left, today in the Musée Carnavalet, employs an Ionic order and a figure of the general in modern dress, rather than the ancient Roman toga of the statue as executed. Here also are two figures below, offer laurel wreaths, a motif which was included on the revolutionary pediment of the Pantheon by Moite, its original sculptor, which was in the process at just that moment of being removed under the direction and supervision of one of Vaudoyer's other architecture professors, Louis-Pierre Baltard. Here, Vaudoyer proposes an unmistakable echo of the Pantheon with the inscription, and this is quite key, probably difficult to read in my bad slide, to the illustrious warrior, to the eloquent orator, to the grand citizen, la patrie reconnaissante, the appreciative fatherland. This project also reveals that the young architect and sculptor had already agreed on the themes to be treated in bas-reliefs set into the base on the other three sides, other than where the door, permanently closed door to the casket was to be laid. These were to represent great moments in the public life of the general. These were scenes from the Napoleonic campaign in Spain. Here you see the final monument as built. Now we get instead to General Foix from the citizens. Here, the reference to Foix as a warrior in the Napoleonic Wars, in particular his role in the Spanish campaigns. Foix here at the tribunal. These are how they have been, the originals are actually in place, and they've been placed under these glass protections, so they're extremely difficult to photograph, and so I've tried by giving you two bad slides to hope that that would make one good one. Here you see him orating in the Chamber of Deputies in the lower house, and a third relief, and this is the most interesting for us, which was to represent the funerary procession, in Vaudoyer's words, a remarkable historical fact as well. So the funeral becomes the third historical event of this chronicle, this almost predella, if you will, of contemporary events. Wasn't it extraordinary, Vaudoyer wrote to his father, to see a whole people accompanying a deputy all the way to Pere Lachaise in the strong rain, and in fact to compete with one another for the honor of carrying his casket to his grave. The inscription, he indicates, is accompanied by two spirits, this is in the original plan, one of eloquence and one of military genius. David d'Angers would say later that the realized monument was conceived like a poem, quote, to which the bas-reliefs are like appendices or explanatory notes. The notion for a scholar of art history that a sculptor should be interested in footnotes is really wonderful, this idea of the footnotes to the main statue. But I think the most interesting is this combination of allegory and history, that allegory and history should be combined in the mission taken on by the sculptor to capture the historical importance of even recent events. These events played an important role in the evolution of David d'Angers' work, who became a convinced Republican in the wake of this experience, asking only to be paid for the cost of his materials here. The funeral in the monument also played an important role as a prototype for other events, especially in, there's a view of the students carrying the casket and the inscription. And then there are literally scores of these engravings, often depicting relatively young males in a kind of art conversation or some kind of debate using a kind of personal oration in triangulation with the orator, and almost always with a background of the city. The funeral in the monument played an important role then as a prototype for other events, especially in 1827, when elections permitted an important number of liberals to enter the lower house, the chamber. Among them were Casimir Périer and Jacques Laffitte, who had both delivered funeral orations for Foix. The death of Jacques-Antoine Manuel a few weeks before the election allowed the opposition to cement their public support. So here a funeral will actually become part of the electoral campaign. Manuel had been removed from the chamber in 1825 for having denounced the war in Spain, in a remark interpreted by the ultras as an incitement to regicide. This had ended his political career abruptly, but had made him immediately a martyr in the new battle for liberty. His engraved portrait circulated throughout France, and the house that he shared with the popular poet, songwriter Béranger, appropriately enough in the Rue des Martyrs, it sounds like he was planning it, became a pilgrimage site. Manuel died after a long illness at Laffitte's Château de Maison on the 20th of August, 1827. His funeral was the culminating event in the politicization of Pere Lachaise, but it also began to show signs of a splintering of the opposition. But for this radical, indeed the banking interests that had supported Foix refused to open their purses for the even more radical Manuel, whose tomb in the end is a simple pile of stones. So to compare this, you can actually trace almost a small-scale chronology of the opposition from this absolutely stunning monument, the Pantheon, of course, almost always appearing in the background here, to the monument of Manuel, which is basically an unadorned, very primitive pile of stones, to which later David d'Angers added these joint portraits. As I said, it's a simple mass with two medallions added by David d'Angers in the 1850s, when Béranger, the poet, joined his friend. There's a whole history of these kind of common tombs of romantic and engaged friendship. But the inscriptions could not be clear enough. Well, unfortunately don't have photographs of them. On one side, to Manuel from his compatriots, his concitoyens. On the other side, La patrie attend pour lui d'autres honneurs. The fatherland is waiting for other honors for him. So nothing could be clearer of this as someone who deserves to be in the Pantheon. And here's the monument of Casimir Périer, the greatest of the period. After the July Revolution in 1830, funeral ceremonies and tombs remained contested sites, but the territory began to shift. Despite Louis-Philippe's promise to return the Church of Sainte-Geneviève to its role as the Pantheon for honoring great men, no pantheonization took place there during the July Monarchy. Already in the winter of 1830, faced with the indecision of the new king of the French as to the proper honors to accord the victims of the July Revolution, the populace was pushed to take matters in their own hands. The ambiance was already tense during the trial of the former ministers of Charles X, when the eminent liberal opposition leader, Benjamin Constant, died on the 8th of December, 1830. His funerary procession was diverted by popular demand at the Place de la Bastille. Here are two images of the Place de la Bastille, which at just that point was again a construction site, as the elephant of Napoleon was being replaced by the monument to the victims of the July Revolution. But at that point, the funeral procession, which was headed uphill towards Pere Lachaise, was diverted across the river, across this bridge that you see here, towards the Pantheon to demand the rights of entry. The students took up the idea admitted by the historian François Guizot during the funeral procession that a new generation should be honored with pantheonization. But when the commission vacillated and proposed a 30-year waiting period to be eligible for pantheonization, it's the exact same period adopted by the New York City Landmarks Commission, interestingly enough, 30 years to wait to be eligible for pantheonization, the crowd instead marched again, busts of Foix and Manuel, towards the domed building. Years later, Guizot wrote of how difficult it was to convince the crowd to allow the busts to be deposited at the Hôtel de Ville, awaiting legal resolution. On the 28th of November, 1831, Vaudoyer and David's monument was at last ready to be inaugurated. Do I have another image of it? No. We'll go there in a second. But Foix's widow asked for a quite discreet ceremony in order to avoid public street protests. 6 years later, 1837, when David was finishing sculpting the pediment of the Pantheon, the presence of Manuel among those honored in the bas-relief would once again lead to an effort to downplay the inauguration. So now we need to turn to the other site, the Pantheon, and look at the evolution of probably one of David Donger's most famous commission, undoubtedly, the resculpting of the pediment of this controversial building. And there he places the fatherland, giving honor, and at her feet, history, engraving the famous names, while liberty throws to them crowns. And this is the first sketch of that allegorical figure at the center, and rather like in the Foix monument, surrounded by real portraits on either side. This was, of course, a site that had played out political vicissitudes by this point for over 40 years. And here it is interesting, in turning again to the most famous and the most studied of David Donger's commissions, to think of the larger architectural and urban context, where the Montagne Sainte-Geneviève would become a locus of a whole generation of politicized artists and art critics, a group that soon included the self-defined group of architects who had made common cause, common romantic cause, against the entrenched academic view defended by Quatremain de Quincy, here sculpted by David Donger, to be, in a certain sense for them, succeeded by and a rallying point around a figure that we need now to encounter, also portrayed by David Donger, Hippolyte Fortoul. Hippolyte Fortoul was, in fact, a cousin of Manuel from the south of France, who came up to Paris to become a law student, but soon became engaged in aesthetic contemplation, and in particular, taking an activist role in the Saint-Simonianist activities, particularly around the publications of the Saint-Simonian splinter group led by the philosophers Pierre Leroux and Jean Reynaud. The editorial offices of their publications, which included popular encyclopedias, manuals, magazines that we'll need to turn to, became a kind of salon or meeting point for the opposition who had gone over the passage of 1830. Hippolyte Fortoul would become one of the major forces in translating Pierre Leroux's call for a social art, an art social, into an active engagement with a new generation of artists, including David Donger, but also the young architects who had rallied around Henri Labrouste in his great standoff against the Academy over the interpretation of classical antiquities. So here's the exhibition that Susan Galassi referred to, the Labrouste exhibition, and these are, in fact, this was a problem bringing this into the Museum of Modern Art, how to convince people that these were radical political statements that got people really bent out of shape, and they saw a whole new vision of the possibility of meaning and its relationship to history in the years 1828 to 1830, when this remained a continuous battle. I don't have time to go into this famous incident so much, but it is important at least to quote it here. In essence, it had to do with Henri Labrouste's insistence that the classical temples at Paestum were not realizations of a Greek ideal, but progressive steps in the search of Greek colonists in their new Sicilian homeland to find an expression that was their own, that was related to their climatic circumstances, to their political circumstances, and to their changing religious beliefs and the gods that they worshipped in their new context. But the real center of the controversy was over the restoration of this so-called Temple C, which, despite generations of interest in this as a prototypical Doric temple, and therefore a model for emulation, Henri Labrousse had said was not a temple at all, but was a civic basilica, a secular building, and therefore also restored the shields of honor that citizens had placed there. It's another displaced Pantheon in a way, and well as inscriptions that were decided upon by the people, some of them returning naval figures who engraved ships and their names there. And then quickly turned around also and said, if you don't like the fact that my monument is restored with graffiti and the residue of ceremonies, it's because, unlike you, we believe that monuments only come to mean something and to exist once they have begun to live in symbiosis with the present and with their society. A monument needs at least 5 years to assume a meaning as a social transformer and as a social actor. This was seen immediately as the equivalent for architecture of the fight over Hugo's Hernani, a famous romantic claque in which Hippolyte Fortoul himself had taken place. Now, through this Saint-Simonian-inspired project of publication, which included the penny press illustrated Magasin Pittoresque, the group devoted, and which had a lot to say about architecture, both historical and even glimpsing into new apartment houses there. The group devoted themselves to the notion that the press, particularly the now inexpensive press, with advances in printing and with cheap paper, would be, quote unquote, the public square of the 19th century. Nonetheless, it might be said that this was not confined to the diffusion of information by press, but also the diffusion of information to the real public square. So I think it's interesting actually to make that juxtaposition in a moment when we worry so much about the relationship between the real and the virtual world of our internet age. It was very much a worry about the press in the 1830s. Were there time we would want to consider Dubon's transformation of the École des Beaux-Arts itself, a veritable laboratory of an important theme for all of Romantic culture, but in particular for the dynamic interchanges between architecture and sculpture in forming a public art, an art social, in the 1830s, namely the relationship between larger forces in defining the shape of history, in responding to the motors of change that were the subject of the study of the great Romantic historians, so inspiring for all of these artists, Augustin Thierry, François Guizot, Jules Michelet, all of whom were very, very popular writers, read as much in the academy as in the home. And they differed on the role that individuals, and thus of individual artists, played in the evolution of social, cultural, and political forms. Now, I would love to spend a great deal of time with you on this, but I want to get us back to David d'Angers, and we'll return here. Obviously, it was very easy for architecture through its evocation of style, either in newly reworked motifs or here in the reworking of the fragments left over by the Museum of French Monuments, which have been housed in this former monastery. Dubon will come in and add a building here and restyle this forecourt, but he will get fragments that had been collected here from demolished buildings under the Revolution and create a kind of sequence for the students that it's itself a historical journey that will take them past the transition from the medieval to the Renaissance with a fragment of the Château de Gaillon, past the flourishing of the French Renaissance as independent from the Italian Renaissance with Philibert Delorme's Château d'Annette and a whole series of others leading up to what he saw as his synthetic modern building out of the themes of a palace of study. So this accumulation of fragments. But what was the role here for sculpture? Could sculpture even represent time in the same way? Could sculpture represent the relationship in the end, and this would become important, of the role of the individual in relationship to the larger historical forces that were so easy for architecture to depict? These are the views that were created for an album given to the Hohenzollerns on a marriage, and again, culminating then in the role that painting and sculpture would play in this synthesis of the historicist arts, we might say, in the amphitheater where prizes were given under this allegorical set of figures throwing out laurel crowns and surrounded on either side by a pantheon of the great artists who were the motors of stylistic and cultural change. Finally, Fortoul writes, the government has allowed us to discover the great pediment of the Pantheon, talking about David d'Angers. This did not come down on the revolution, the anniversary day of the revolution, for fear that it would give rise to opposition protest in the streets. He calls it a beautiful page of history, written by its artist under the inspiration of the people, writing in the Saint-Simonian journal La Nouvelle Minerve in 1837. Now, already at the end of 1830, the Ministry of Public Instruction, Guizot, had approved the choice of figures to be included in the fourth pediment to be sculpted on this building in less than 50 years. Neil McWilliam and Jacques Decazo have studied this well, and so I don't need to go into it in detail, but I do want just to point out a few facts. The Saint-Simonian magazine Pittoresque reported on David d'Angers himself, saying, after having given up for several days the chisel for the rifle during the Revolution, he took up again his chisel and sculpted the pediment of the Pantheon, an enormous and beautiful work, which is enough to establish his great reputation. 3 allegorical figures flanked by great men, those very figures refused in the 1820s. On the left, there it is, in situ. I just want to take you through its history very quickly. That's the Moit's pediment. There you see it removed under the Revolution, blank. Perhaps they should have left it that way. It would have stayed that way. This is Baltard trying to see if Moit's great work can be saved by turning this mythologizing imagery into Christian imagery. In the end, a cross is put there, and that is in turn scraped off for David d'Angers' great monument. On the left, Voltaire, Rousseau, Mirabeau, Malesherbes, figures from the church and then also figures from science, but also Manuel and Lafayette, as well as artists, Jacques-Louis David, revolutionary artist and namesake, scientists, Bichat, Cuvier, Monge, and the students who had followed funeral processions, like those of Foix, Manuel, and Constant de Pere Lachaise. During the whole evolution, Fortoul and David were comparing notes on their interests in the philosophy of history, both profiting from trips to Germany, where they wrote letters of recommendation and introduction for one another, and where they were interested not only in the effects of the ideas of Hegel on the polity, but also on the function of historical representation in architecture and public representation. Fortoul would defend at once David d'Angers' effort to render legible the great meaning of the Pantheon, a building frozen in a denuded idealism of 18th century neoclassicism, he thought, and which his group of friends considered the nadir of vacant formalism. Even while within a year of the unveiling, another hero of the group, Henri Labrouste, would create a pendant to the building on the north side of the square. The pediment, Fortoul writes, was the veritable face of the building. This is wonderful in French because it's playing on fronton for pediment and front for your forehead. The pediment, Fortoul writes, was the veritable forehead of the building, just as the forehead is on the face of a man where one reads his thoughts. The thought that directs him, the sentiment which animates his being. So on the front of a temple, one should be able to read the soul that animates its life. The pediment wasn't simply an ornament and a preface, it was the legible summary of the temple. It was the place where religious ideas to which one sacrificed victims in the sanctuaries were unveiled before the eyes of the crowd. Monsieur David understands thus the pediment of the Pantheon. Commissioned, Fortoul writes, to decorate the face of a temple in which there is neither sanctuary nor image nor altar, he felt that in an ever more vivid way it was necessary to put on the pediment everything that was missing in the building. And his chisel, so elegant and so energetic at the same time, engraved here the admirable character that the people had given to the mission of this monument. No less would Fortoul be the interpreter of the efforts of the I just had these terrific slides, so I thought you would see them. Get up and close and actually recognize by name. You see the heads are considerably larger for the perspectival effect, the Napoleonic soldiers, and the students. No less would Fortoul be the interpreter of the efforts of the Romantic architects to translate that task of David's into architecture, whether it be in Dubon's picturesque grouping of fragments, Vaudoyer's deployment of historical and new buildings. There's a wonderful view of the pediment about 1860. Vaudoyer, here's deployment of historical and new buildings at the Conservatoire des Arts et Métiers, a true popular institution, or in the most synthetic building of all, with which we must end, the Sainte-Geneviève Library, the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève, which dialogued with the former church of Sainte-Geneviève. Here you see the former church, now the Pantheon, the pediment up here, and I'm interested in the dialogue between this project and this architectural project of these two men who intersected in the circles of these ex-Saint-Simonians. Here, from 1838 to 1850, Henri Labrouste strove to create a monument that was the veritable crucible of the stylistic evolution of architecture. Here you see it from the roof of the church, this long box taking the, if you could almost say that the Abbey of Sainte-Geneviève, which is just behind both of these buildings, had in the 18th century its church removed to become a public monument of royalty, very troublesome on the public stage ever since then. Around 1835, its library was removed from the monastery, and Labrouste was confronted with building the first freestanding expression of a library in modern France. He saw it very much as a temple of great thought, of great writers, of great men, and very much, therefore, brilliantly placed in relationship to a church that had just been returned to that cult. Now, the building is very complex, quite austere, no fragments here, no references to fragments of history, but it incorporates a medley of thought on the evolution of architectural types towards the modern library. Indeed, in its arcaded top structure, it recalls not only Renaissance palazzos, but modern assembly halls. But most importantly, in its extraordinary interior, which is the direct reference to the exterior, and we'll see this in a moment where the books actually become the inscriptions on the outside. In its double-barreled space, it was the successor to earlier great secular spaces of public assembly. In ancient times, the basilica, I think we had seen it, well, we saw it already, that bisected space of inscriptions and ceremonial hangings. In medieval times, the refectory, where the monks listened to the word and then ate silently in communion. But in the modern times, to the consumption of the printed book, the objects of the press, the public square, to be here realized in this great reading room where one read together in public. A very complex building. It's been analyzed for its historical richness many, many times over, but often in isolation from its dialogue with the Pantheon as a building and with the Great Commission of David d'Angers that was inaugurated months before the design and construction of this building began. And there I think you can see quite clearly the books which then give rise to a pantheon of names, many of whom are not in the Pantheon, a universalist pantheon of names that moves from earliest mythological times to recent scientists, passing through many figures of the Enlightenment and many figures who had been in and out of the Pantheon, as well as the great hero since his translation in 1827 into French of Jean-Baptiste Vico, the great philosopher of history and of the nature of history as cyclical and changing. Obviously, Rousseau, an enormous number of people who formed a kind of catechism, if you will, of historical knowledge in relationship to the challenges of the present. But inscribed onto this building, then, which eschews all monumental sculpture, are nonetheless the words of printing. Here is played out even more powerfully the relationship between the capacity of architecture to represent larger forces. Architecture, Fortoul said, was the veritable handwriting of peoples of civilizations, and that dialectic between civilizations and the roles of individuals here embodied in names. It is no surprise that Gutenberg should play such an important role for both Labrouste and for David d'Angers, that first printer. David d'Angers turning, there's the dialogue that continues between the statues of the great men that are added at the end of the 19th century and Labrouste's library. So there's a very rich dialogue here across these spaces. David d'Angers turning in 1839 to a commission from the city of Strasbourg here to Gutenberg in historic costume with his first printed sheets, inaugurated in 1840 in the presence of David d'Angers for the 400th anniversary of printing. Below were a series of bas-reliefs of the benefits of printing in America, Africa, and Asia. For the USA, we see Benjamin Rush, Lewis Morris, Jefferson, Lafayette, Washington, Benjamin Franklin, who holds the Declaration of Independence, as well as Bolivar, who is greeting a black man. In Africa, we see the end of slavery. You see that here. Blacks are freed from their chains by Wilberforce, Clarkson, Condorcet, and the Abbé Grégoire. David wanted to do a monument to this for years. And in Asia, we see Mohammed. In 1875, there's America all your friends here. In 1875, as his last design, Labrousse would erect a monument to the early Parisian printer Ulrich Gehrig in the vestibule of the library. Now to conclude, in the first months of the Second Republic, as the Pantheon was being prepared once again for conversion under the Second Republic, now to a temple of humanity, of universalism, featuring the paligenesis of the painter Chenavard under this, the apotheosis of Louis XVIII, and then under it, the apotheosis of society and of man. And the decision was made to retain David d'Angers' pediment. Labrousse and David d'Angers found themselves directly involved under the short-lived Second Republic. Soon after having been named Minister of the Interior under the Second Republic, Ledru-Rollin appointed David and Labrousse members of a commission to study questions about finishing the monument to Napoleon in the Invalides, even though 1 year earlier David had refused to be involved in a statue for the tomb of Napoleon. And then, a few months later, to a commission in order to look at reforms for the training of artists at the French school in Rome and at the École des Beaux-Arts. By the time the generation of 1830 in architecture were at work on their masterworks of synthetic history for the Second Empire, Vaudoyer in the Cathedral at Marseille, Henri Labrousse in the Bibliothèque Nationale, and Dubon in the final extensions of the École des Beaux-Arts, David had returned from a political exile due to his opposition to the Second Empire. So here they seem to split in a way. The architects taking advantage, perhaps politically compromised, of the coup d'etat of Napoleon III, David d'Angers going into exile. He died back in France in 1856. If he had lost touch with the architects with whom he had briefly made common cause, he was nonetheless upheld by them as a figure of great historical importance, even as they more and more complied with the regime, rather than defining the capacity of art, the regime in order to define the capacity of art through both the collective envisioning of space and the deployment of exemplary biographical sequences to serve as social transformers. There is David d'Angers, 1856, you can guess where. It was not only the English who would honor David d'Angers in the Prince Albert monument erected in the 1860s in Hyde Park, but also Dubon, who would revise the history of style and great civilization moments in the forecourt of the École des Beaux-Arts with the addition of these lava enamel plaques done by Paul Bazat in the 1870s. Alongside medallions of some of the great figures, Louis David, the architects Charles Percier, Hippolyte Lebas, and Nicolas Huyot, the kind of forefather of the Romantic point of view, kind of history of the evolution of a historicist architectural point of view, is placed finally another great hero, David d'Angers. All of them represent a progression towards a structured view of historical progress and its relationship to the present, to which so appropriately was added this homage to David d'Angers in enameled Vikernic stone, today very much weathered, but I think still a testimony to the mutual projects and influence of Romantic sculptors and of architects in the years around 1830. Thank you very much.
I thought I'd just ask one or two questions quickly before we run out and have some wine and see the show. Professor Bergdoll, it was so wonderful to hear this discussion of the intersections between sculptors and architects during the period, because I feel as if it's not something that happens terribly often in the scholarship. And I certainly was unaware of some of the connections between the figures. And I was wondering if you might talk a little more broadly about relationships between sculptors and architects in the first part of the 19th century. Did they follow similar curricula at the École des Beaux-Arts, for example? And then on large projects, was there one clear defined way, one clear sort of relationship between the roles of architects and sculptors in the production of, say, a tomb monument like the one to General Foix? Was it specified who did what came first, etc.?
I suspect that there are probably as many stories as there are commissions, although the Foix monument is absolutely exceptional in this. I have never come across this notion that there's an architectural competition and the winner of the competition then establishes a consultation with 6 competing sculptors. That to me is I think that's a part of the hyper-democratic opposition of this monument, that everything about the way it happened is meant to be a statement against convention. But I think that the architects, one of the big changes in the French Academy after the Revolution is that the Academy of Architecture was abolished and became part of the École, was shared under the Academy of the Fine Arts. And so there was much closer relationship in side-by-side instruction in the École of the sculptors, the architects, the painters, the engravers. And then where they really make their connections are during the 5 years in Rome. So all of these Grand Prix become a kind of tight-knit cohort. And I think that you can often track either the success or failure of these through friendship connections. So that would be an interesting project to do. I can't really generalize, but there are all sorts of ways. There's been a whole generation of study of the artistic bureaucracy of 19th century France, which has revealed to us an enormous amount of its mechanisms, but seems to be written by people who work in wonderful places where bureaucracies work without the intervention of individuals. So they never take into account the fact of who knew who was rooting for who went around this way, et cetera. There's such a separation between historical analysis and lived experience in that case. And I think it's actually all of that manipulating the system that explains some of the most successful associations. If you go through the history of public architecture, and which almost always has a sculptural component in 19th century France. Oh, you had a second question.
And were there ever conflicts between sculptors and architects for, say, facades of buildings and other commissions like that?
Well, there is a whole litany among this group of collaborations that they considered unsuccessful in the 1820s of their fathers' generations, and I can't think of one off the top of my head, but even in just going back over my notes to put this together, in the last few days I came upon many references to what they thought were failed, and I think that is also part of the idea of having the architect choose 6 sculptors who might be appropriate. In particular, they thought that the association of Bozio and Lebas was a flop. Now, why they thought that was, that I'll leave to you as the sculpture person.
Well, I think we might leave it at that. And head outside and continue the conversation outside.